Okay, so welcome to our third installment of Torah Tuesday. And as we've been doing, we are going to continue with some, I don't know, and maybe underappreciated stories or just events in the Tanakh, in the Torah. And the last two times, I feel like we've done, of course, the first time we talked about the witch of Endor, but really the main character was King Saul. So we talked about King Saul, and then last week we talked about Samson. And this week I decided I wanted to focus on a woman this time because, come on. So we're going to look at Bathsheba, however you want to pronounce her name. And yeah, she has a really interesting arc, I think. But also, like, there's so much mystery I really want to think about. We'll read the text, but there's just not a lot around what Bathsheba is feeling in her experience and how she's experiencing things. We kind of get told about like what she does, but not a lot about what's going on behind the scenes. So we'll kind of look into that as we go forward. So just to give a little background, so we're going to kind of do two major stories that involve Bathsheba. And the first one's in the book of 2 Samuel, and it's with King David, right? So King David is Saul's son, and he's kind of the next king after Saul. So we're going to look at that one. And then we're going to look at a story with Bathsheba and one of her sons, King Solomon, who then becomes king. So those are the two. Yeah, so we're in kind of that period. And I think everything else that you need for background will be in the story. Yeah. Does anyone have a question before we launch in? Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to share, I will say I found on Sefaria. If you don't know Sefaria, it's amazing. I'll put it in sefaria.org, and they have, all of the texts that you could want. The Jewish texts that you could want are there, and they're in translation. It's really an incredible tool. But anyway, so on there, I found a way someone had laid out this story in like acts. He had broken it up into like scenes, and so I like that. So we're gonna look at that first, which is a little different than my usual Google Doc, and it's put together by Daniel Rose, who works for the Sachs Foundation. So credit to him. So that's what I'm going to share with you now. Sorry. Okay, share screen. Okay, here we go. So just gonna. Okay, so we're in the book of 2 Samuel. And we have David, who's the king. And the thing to know is so all of King David's army, they're all out in battle, and they're sieging this place, and David has not gone with them. So it's kind of an interesting question of like, why isn't David out? He should be out fighting with all of the men, right? So it was men at that time. He should be out fighting. Like that's what the king's supposed to do, is supposed to kind of accompany, and he is not. So that's the prologue. I'll read the prologue, and then you can think if you want to read. So the turn of the year, the season when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him, and they devastated Ammon and besieged Rabbah. David remained in Jerusalem. And so we have like already we kind of have a setup, and maybe you've heard the story, maybe you haven't, but already we kind of have this setup of like something's not right? Like this is the season when kings go out to battle, but David, who's like King David, is in Jerusalem. So there's already something off here. So we're already getting like a clue that something's not quite right. Okay, so enough about that. Okay, so now I got scene one. Would someone like to read for us? Some leaders delegate, thanks to maybe he was a good delegator during.
I'll read.
Okay, Ruth. And I see Adele, so I'll come to Adele after. Yeah.
Oh, it's Adele. Okay.
There'll be plenty to read for everyone. So.
Late one afternoon, David rose from his couch and strolled on the roof of the royal palace. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and the king sent someone to make inquiries about the woman. He reported, "She is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, and wife of Uriah the Hittite." David sent messengers to fetch her. She came to him, and he lay with her. She had just purified herself after her period, and she went back home.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, the story got racy fast. So, right, so David is, again, he didn't go out to battle, and so he's just kind of hanging out. He's, strolling on the roof of the royal palace, and he sees this woman who we find out is Bathsheba. She's very beautiful. And he hears that, this is who she is. She's Bathsheba, and she's married, right? She's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. But that doesn't matter to David because he's the king, so he feels entitled, and he, comes, he, says, okay, like, bring her to me. And, they have sex, and then she goes back home. So, and of course, right, there's this interesting piece of the text felt that it was necessary for them to clarify that she had purified herself, right? There's the Jewish practice of Torah mishpacha, of this idea of going to the mikveh after your period to purify herself. And so they make sure to tell us that Bathsheba had done that. So, I mean, I think in some ways it might be like giving us a clue about her, right? Like, we're told she's painted as this righteous woman because she makes sure that she's engaging in those practices around her body. And then she goes back home. Of course, the other problematic thing is, like, she did just commit adultery, but we'll get into that in a moment. So, okay. So there you go. So she did that. Ruth, do you want to keep going?
The woman conceived, and she sent word to David, "I am pregnant." I don't think she would have said it that way, but anyway. Thereupon, David sent a message to Joab, "Send Uriah the Hittite to me." And Joab sent Uriah to David.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, so we have, I'm just going to pull this back up. Right, okay, so we have our introduction to Bathsheba. We're told she's beautiful. Right, she then, David sends her, she goes, she seems like at least a willing party. And then she conceives, right, she gets pregnant. So now David obviously has a problem because if Bathsheba is pregnant and her husband's been away at battle for a while, it's going to be obvious that there was some infidelity of some sort going on. So David's about to hatch up a plot to try and fix this situation. But before we see that, I'm just curious, like, how are you reading Bathsheba here? I mean, I think, like, if what do you feel like maybe Bathsheba is feeling, or her experiences and all that? We don't get much clues, right? She sends word to David, "Oh, I'm pregnant." But, like, is she nervous? Is she like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Or is she just accepting? Or, like, what's happening here? What do you feel like is happening here for Bathsheba? You can feel free to take yourself off mute or type in the chat. Okay, Mindy, you said, "I'm not impressed with her character." Say more. You're not impressed that she just, like, was willing and went along with it? Do you want to see her do something differently? So type it. Yeah, Ruth.
He was.
Ruth, you're kind of cutting out. Your sound.
Sorry, I think he was the king. She didn't have a choice. If the king says to you, "You're going to sleep with me," are you going to say no? Then he might do worse things, or he might make sure.
Yeah. So sorry, I'm just gonna stop the share for a sec. So yeah, so you're saying that, right, there wasn't really this element of choice because she's just this random lady and he's the king. And so if, the king's saying, okay, like you need to come, she doesn't really, it would be hard to say no. Definitely. And I know Mindy, you said you're not impressed because she committed adultery. So you're giving her a little bit more, what's the word? Like responsibility in this, in terms of, a little bit that she had more not initiative, but was able to kind of make that choice in a way. Yeah, Anna.
We're judging her on today's our standards of today. We don't know what the standards were back then, although I'm quite sure adultery wasn't accepted then. But still, as was said, it's the king. So what do you do,
Yeah, definitely. And we don't know her social status. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's, and also just, not to mention, Anna, like you were saying, the role of women and how much, were women able to, how much were women able to like stand up for themselves or not? How much was that accepted back in the day? And it's, and yeah, Doreen says it was the king. Yeah, you don't really, I'm not sure how much choice you have with the king, but maybe, I don't know. I mean, we're going to see in a little bit, we'll see a story of Bathsheba kind of standing up to David in a way. So we can see how that story coming up kind of sheds light on this one. But yeah, it's definitely, we don't get anything, right? She just, as at least really according to just the simple reading of the text, is kind of accepting of it all. She's almost like she's not the main character here. Like David is the main character. So we get to see like David's reaction and how King David is experiencing it. And Bathsheba is just almost like an object. Like she's the one she's kind of a part of this experience, but the experience is happening to David. Okay, so I'll share the screen again. We can keep going. Okay, so now, so she's pregnant, so David has a problem. I mean, she does too, but I think David, trying to avoid some scandal maybe. So here we go. So he has a plan. So he's summoned Uriah, right? So David has sent a message to Yoav. That's spelled Joab here. So Yoav is the general, and so David sends a message to Yoav and says, okay, let's get Uriah back here. So Uriah has been summoned back to Jerusalem out of battle. Yeah. Okay, Adele, do you want to take over?
Is it Uriah? Is that how you pronounce it?
I would say Uriah.
Uriah. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab and the troops were faring and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and bathe your feet." When Uriah left the royal palace, a present from the king followed him.
So Uriah, so David, if this isn't obvious here, David is trying to get Uriah to go home and like sleep with his wife. And so, he's asking how the battle's going, and then he's like, okay, go home, like relax, you're here now, you have a break. And so Uriah left, and the present from the king followed him. But then Uriah is not playing into David's plan. So what's he doing? Adele.
Uriah slept at the entrance of the royal palace along with the other officers of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When David was told that Uriah had not gone down to his house, he said to Uriah, "You just came from a journey. Why didn't you go down to your house?" Uriah answered David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are located at Sukkot, and my master Joab and your majesty's men are camped in the open. How can I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live by your very life, I will not do this."
Okay, so we'll pause. All right, so again, David's really trying to get Uriah to go home and hang out with his wife. And Uriah's saying, how can I, right? He's sort of saying, everyone, like the army, they're out there, they're sleeping outside in the open, they're in battle. How could I possibly, knowing, everyone else is doing that, how could I possibly go home and sleep with my wife? And there's different kind of ideas around if Uriah knew what was happening, like knew what David was trying to do or not. And I think it's interesting to read this either way. So if Uriah like doesn't know, he's just totally innocent, and he's like, genuinely like, I can't do this. Right? Uriah is clearly the better man in terms of Uriah and David, because David has literally let all of his men go out to battle and sleep out in the open, and he's hanging out in his, mansion, palace, castle. So he's doing the opposite of that. And so you have Uriah, who actually is, understanding of this communal thing, and says, okay, how can I do this if everyone else is out in battle? Or if Uriah does know, it's kind of still a veiled critique of David. So it's whether or not kind of Uriah knows in some way his critique, or if it's more of an innocent thing that just highlights the difference between him and King David. Yeah, any thoughts on this or reactions to this?
Uriah does sound like the better man.
Yeah. Committed, and he's like, I'm not going to just take this luxury because you happen to summon me back. Sure, definitely makes it hard for King David. Okay, can continue on.
David said to Uriah, stay here today also, and tomorrow I will send you off. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. The next day, David summoned him, and he ate and drank with him until he got him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep in the same place with the Lord's officers. He did not go down to his home.
Okay, so David tries one more time. He's like, maybe if I get him drunk, he will want to go home and sleep with his wife. But even so, even drunk, Uriah was still like a man of integrity. And it's like, no, I'm still not going to go home and sleep inside my house and sleep with my wife. I'm going to stay and sleep in the same place with all of the other officers. So okay, Uriah's basically left David with not a lot of options here, at least in David's mind. So what's David do?
In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, which he sent to Uriah. He wrote in the letter as follows: place Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then fall back so that he may be killed.
Right. This is, pretty like tragic that, so Uriah, because he has been a man of virtue and, kind of put David in this difficult situation that ultimately David put himself in. So David's really at fault. David decides that he needs to get rid of Uriah. So he's going to have the general put Uriah on the front line so that, it'll be sure that he's killed, and not just put him on the front line, but put him on the front line and then kind of leave him uncovered, so that he'll be killed. It's pretty icky. I don't know. It's always like David really is, when we talk about how, the Messiah is supposed to come from the line of David, and this whole thing about the Davidic line. And then we read stories about him, and yeah, some are nice, but this one is, I'd say pretty bad. Right? We have adultery, and now we have murder, and yes, Ruth.
This wasn't the first time that David did this. He did it when he was near Hebron. It was that the man who had lots of riches, and he had a beautiful wife, and he got the man killed so that he could take the wife as one of his wives.
Yeah, so David definitely is, there's a pattern. This isn't a one-off type of thing. And yes, so there you go. We have, I mean, it's also, something to ponder is just how power can corrupt judgment. And right, that is it because David has all of this power and he's able to get away with it? Is that why he's doing it? Or does he kind of like lose some of his judgment because he's just able to do whatever he wants?
I would think if he can take all these women at his will, then why bother killing the men? He's the all-powerful. What does he care? And that seems to be his attitude. He doesn't care.
Yeah.
Not nice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, yeah, it is. Adele, you bring up this question of why did he have to kill Uriah? What was that? What was that accomplishing here? Because he could probably just like take his wife anyway. But I guess with Uriah dead, then Bathsheba is no longer married. I mean, they probably could have forced her to get a divorce, but maybe this seems like an easier way because you can't really force a divorce on someone.
Yeah, but
yeah,
if he doesn't get killed, if he doesn't die, and Bathsheba has a baby, and Uriah says, I haven't slept with her, this is a woman who's committed adultery, then Bathsheba gets killed.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, Bathsheba could definitely, yeah, that's punishment for adultery. So that's a good point. So maybe that's a reason that he needs Uriah gone. Yeah, and then Doreen, you're saying he does care how it looks. He tries to still look respectable. Yes, there's also the optics piece of this. So there's the kind of practical piece, and yeah, he's trying to cover up what he did in some ways. And this is a good cover up because okay, she's pregnant, but her husband's dead, and so now I'm rightfully married to her, and it's fine, and nothing inappropriate went on here. Of course it did, but he can kind of cover it up. He's trying to cover it up. Yeah, so it's trying to look respectable. It's like it's easier to look respectable when you actually are respectable, but yeah, right, that like he has to kill someone for it to kind of look okay. Yikes. Okay, so then we have, I see another chat. Okay, Eric says, although difficult, the story is humanizing. We don't see our leaders as perfect or divine, but human with relatable weaknesses. David is still ultimately able to achieve good in his life despite his failings. This gives hope to us. Hopefully we don't do things as off the path as David does, but we do not need to despair and can still do good things. Yeah, I mean, I think I like agree and disagree with you because I think that yes, it's good to like humanize our leaders and humanize kind of these people in the Bible who were seen as like, oh wow, like on this pedestal, right? To say no, they're still human and they still have faults. But I feel like my question is kind of at what point do the faults outweigh those like good leadership traits and characteristics? And at obviously in King David's time, he's not going to lose his position for committing adultery. But right now, like we're seeing, especially like if you're doing something non-consensual with someone, I would argue that you probably should lose your position of power, right? So I think it's like, yes, leaders can make mistakes and we all make mistakes. And then that question of, okay, when does the mistake become, or that fault become something that makes you no longer eligible for leadership? Definitely. Thank you for that. Okay, so we will continue on. So we'll have our act.
So when Joab was besieging the city, he stationed Uriah at the point where he knew that there were able warriors. The men of the city sallied out and attacked Joab, and some of David's officers among the troops fell. Uriah the Hittite was among those who died.
Okay, so there we go. So David's plan worked, and tragically Uriah is dead. We're gonna skip this part. So this is just kind of a recounting of the battle when like Joab tells David like, here's the battle, and Joab is not really letting on that it was on purpose that Uriah was killed, but he's letting David know that Uriah was in fact killed, so he doesn't need to worry about it anymore. And then, yeah, okay, so there we go. So now we're gonna skip to here. So now how does Uriah's wife, aka Bathsheba, right? Like, it's interesting when she's called Bathsheba and when she's called Uriah's wife, but here she's Uriah's wife.
When Uriah's wife heard that her husband, Uriah, was dead, she lamented over her husband. After the period of mourning was over, David sent and had her brought into his palace. She became his wife, and she bore him a son. But the Lord was displeased with what David had done.
Yeah, so, okay, so we have Bathsheba. Again, we don't get a whole lot of clues here about her, but, we do say that she lamented, she mourned her husband. Then after that period of mourning was over, which is probably 30 days, David sends for her, and now she's his wife, and she has a child. So that's kind of story one. And of course, this child is only alive for 7 days and dies. And it's kind of explained as a punishment because there's, the way that this child was conceived. Okay, so we're going to switch over. So that's story one. Of course, it was more about David maybe than Bathsheba, but that's how we meet Bathsheba, and we get some clues about her and her personality, but not a lot. So before we move on to story two, does anyone have questions or comments on this? It's always, I don't know. Yeah, Adele.
I'm just trying to understand, they're Hittites. Does that mean they are not Jews? Are they idol worshipers? What is this distinction? Why is it made?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I know some of the Hittites end up kind of coming into the Jewish fold, but I think you might be right that she isn't Jewish. I want to look that up. We're trying to do it fast. Anyone else know?
It doesn't say she's a Hittite. It says he's a Hittite.
Oh, Uriah the Hittite. Oh, well, but Uriah is fighting. At least we know, a clue we have is that Uriah was fighting in King David's army. So he was at least somehow attached to the people in some way. So whether or not he was Jewish. Yeah. It's a good question. Trying to just see if I can find anything. I'm not getting anything helpful quickly, so I'll have to look it up, or if someone else wants to look it up. Oh, and Eric, you pointed out that Bathsheba, even though she was married to Uriah, who we're not sure what his status is, but she is, going to the mikvah, or she's concerned with ritual purity and observing a mourning period. So that seems to indicate that she's definitely within the Jewish people or the Israelite people at that point. So good catch. Yeah. Cool. Other questions, thoughts, things? Okay. Yeah.
If he wasn't Jewish and she was, then she wouldn't need to get a get.
Yeah, I mean, but they'd still have to separate in some way, but yeah, I'm not sure. Also, some of this discussion is a little bit anachronistic, because I think certain marriage practices look different back then than how they do now, and how they've evolved now. But yeah, these are good questions. Eric, yes, was it common to bathe in the open? So we're thinking about Bathsheba bathing on the roof. So there are some midrashim about this. So one thing I've heard talked about is that she was bathing on the roof, and the only place you could really see onto the roof was from something higher up, And so like he was like really the only one who would probably have been able to see her, because everyone else was below, so maybe she wasn't so worried about it. There's one midrash I saw when I was like looking up things for this session, that talked about how Bathsheba was actually being really modest, and she was like washing her hair, but she was washing it in a bucket in a way that no one could see her hair. It was kind of fully covered and like immersed in the bucket. And then talk about like, Satan, this figure, using an arrow to pierce the bucket and break it open so that her hair has been exposed. And then like David sees the hair. So it's almost that, Bathsheba was being modest, and then this outside force kind of made it like look more immodest. But I mean, I'm sure they didn't have indoor plumbing. So, I mean, I imagine they probably had to bathe outside in some ways. But
when we were in Israel, we saw what would be the house mikveh in the basement, which would be more safe, having all that water down, not up.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think she was, in a mikveh while she was bathing. She was probably just had a bucket of water. But yeah, definitely better to have your mikveh on the bottom floor than the top floor, so if it leaks. But yeah, I mean, we don't know, like maybe she didn't have that in her house either. I mean, I imagine not everyone had a mikveh in their house. That's probably reserved for people with certain means. But yeah, there are a lot of kind of questions around this situation and what was going on, both on David's end and on Bathsheba's end. Yes. Okay. Because yeah, we could, I mean, in some ways we could paint her as like this seductress, but I don't know. I don't like that one. But if you want to, you can do that as well. Okay, so our next story is, we're like fast forwarding a while. So David and Bathsheba, obviously they were married and they had some kids, and one of the kids that they had was Solomon, who, spoiler alert, is going to become King Solomon. But as King David is kind of on his deathbed, there is some disagreement about who is going to follow who's the successor, who's going to be the successor. And so the story we're going to look at is one where Bathsheba in some ways kind of helps scheme to put King Solomon in charge. So we have this disagreement between Adonijah, or as the text will spell it, Adonijah, but Adonijah and Solomon. So Adonijah is another one of King Solomon's kids, but kind of older, with a different wife. And then we have King Solomon. So Adonijah seems to be like the more obvious choice because he's older, and we go by who's eldest. I mean, he's not the oldest son. Most of those King Solomon's sons have died. Not King Solomon, sorry, King David's sons died tragically, but he's one of them. And so we have Adonijah, and then we have Solomon, and so we'll see how it gets resolved. Oh wait, sorry, I have to pull it. Oh no, I don't want to share. Hold on. Okay, gotta get the correct. Okay, yeah. And also just to know that we are also going to learn about, or another person in the story. Hold on, I should make this so you don't need to see like 1,000 tabs. I know that's distracting to some people. Okay, so we also have the prophet Natan, or Nathan. And so as usual in these books of Kings, like we saw in the first week with King Saul, is that there's kind of a prophet that helps the king out. So with Saul, we had Samuel, who, then eventually like turns on Saul because he was doing some bad stuff. But Nathan is kind of the kingmaker, the prophet kingmaker. And so we're going to see him. Okay. Here we go. There we go. Much better. Okay. So we're now in Kings. So our last text was in 2 Samuel. Now we're in Kings. And again, we have Adonijah, who's kind of said he's king. And now Nathan and Bathsheba are going to kind of do a little plot and see what happens. So someone like to read? Okay, I'll read a paragraph and then someone else has to read. Then Nathan said to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, "You must have heard that Adoniah, son of Haggith, has assumed the kingship without the knowledge of our Lord David. Now take my advice so that you may save your life and the life of your son Solomon. Go immediately to King David and say to him, 'Did not you, O Lord King, swear to your maidservant, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit upon my throne? Then why has Adoniah become king? While you are still there talking with the king, I will come in after you and confirm your words.'" Right, so Nathan's kind of the mastermind here, and he's saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to tell David, who's, not well, so he probably is not 100% of right mind. So we're going to say, hey, David, you promised me that my son Solomon was going to become king. Like, how can you forget? And then, so that's what he wants Bathsheba to say. And then Nathan says, okay, and then I'll come in and kind of corroborate the story for you. And so we're both in on it. And then he'll have to make Solomon king. This in some ways reminds me of, there are a bunch of things that reminds me of, but I was just thinking of like Rebecca with Jacob and Esau, because there's this idea of like, okay, there's like the rightful heir, and then there's the person who like should be, and how, right, in both times, either Bathsheba or Rebecca, they're like helping scheme to make the heir who's not obvious get it, or the person that they think is correct. So there you go. Okay. Now who wants to read? Eric.
So Bathsheba went to the king in his chamber. The king was very old, and Abishag the Shunammite was waiting on the king. Bathsheba bowed low in homage to the king, and the king asked, "What troubles you?" She answered him, "My lord, you yourself swore to your maidservant by Adonai your God, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit upon my throne. Yet now Adoniah has become king, and you, my lord the king, know nothing about it. He has prepared a sacrificial feast of a great many oxen, fatlings, and sheep, and he's invited all the king's sons, and Abiathar the priest, and Joab, commander of the army, but he has not invited your servant Solomon. And so the eyes of all Israel are upon you, O Lord King, to tell them who shall succeed my lord the king on the throne. Otherwise, when my lord the king lies down with his fathers, my son Solomon and I will be regarded as traitors."
So I think an interesting thing here is she seems to really be appealing to his sense of ego, to David's ego. Like, Adoniah has taken this position, but he didn't ask you first. He kind of left you out of the loop. And so everyone's, waiting to see what you're going to say and what you're going to do. And you need to, broadcast strength, even as you're going out, but just, you need to defend your position. And just kind of, she's kind of convincing him in that way. So not only is she saying, oh, you said that you were going to do this, which is probably not true, but also, this is about your ego and your legacy. Okay, you want to keep going, Eric?
She was still talking to the king when the prophet Nathan arrived. They announced to the king, "The prophet Nathan is here." And he entered the king's presence. Bowing low to the king with his face to the ground, Nathan said, "O Lord King, you must have said, Adoniah shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit upon my throne. For he has gone down today and prepared a sacrificial feast of a great many oxen, fatlings, and sheep. He invited all the king's sons and the army officers and Abiathar the priest. At this very moment, they are eating and drinking with him, and they are shouting, 'Long live King Adoniah!' But he did not invite me, your servant, or the priest Zadok, or Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, or your servant Solomon. Can this decision have come from my lord the king without your telling your servant? who is to succeed to the throne of my lord the king? King David's response was, summon Bathsheba. She entered the king's presence and stood before the king. And the king took an oath, saying, as Adonai lives, who has rescued me from every trouble, the oath I swore to you by Adonai, the God of Israel, that your son Solomon should succeed me as king, and that he should sit upon my throne in my stead, I will fulfill this very day. Bathsheba bowed low in homage to the king, with her face to the ground. And she said, may my lord King David live forever.
Thank you. Great. So, okay, so stop the share. So, okay, so here's story number 2. Does Bathsheba, I guess, between kind of this story and the earlier story, does Bathsheba strike you? Is she kind of similar? Is she different? Are we seeing a different side of her? Do you see like themes running throughout, or kind of how is she striking?
First of all, you don't know what David said. Maybe he did say to her that Solomon would be the king. You don't know. Maybe she's just reminding him of something that he's already said. On the other hand, maybe she's putting words in his mouth. But we don't know because it doesn't say.
That's true. I mean, you could read it as, this is actually something that the king said. I mean, to me, the thing that seems a little suspect is that Nathan goes to Bathsheba before and it's like, okay, here's what we're going to say to David. And it feels like they're plotting a little bit.
I wonder why they feel one boy is more deserving of the kingship than the other.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's definitely some kind of self-interest involved, right? You want your son to be the king, because then that puts you as mother, you're mother of the king, you have a certain amount of security. And in, both cases, especially if there's some type of rivalry, if you're the mother of the possible heir who doesn't end up being king, you might be seen as a potential enemy or threat. And so that puts you in a really precarious situation. But also, I mean, here, especially with Nathan, so Nathan as this prophet seems to have a sense, is supposed to have a sense at least of God's will and like what God desires. And of course, the king is supposed to be anointed by God. So if Nathan's saying, okay, Nathan's the prophet, so he thinks that Solomon should be king. So therefore, Solomon should be king.
Wasn't there another prophet for the other side? And it was yes. Also a battle between the two prophets.
Definitely, yeah. There's like Abiathar, yeah. So there is like some power struggle going on for both, and of course, a prophet is only a prophet if they get behind the correct power. So yeah, and of course, you can't know that until after the fact. But here, Nathan appears to be, the correct prophet because he's gone behind the correct power. Yeah. Okay. We have, in the chat, in both stories, Bathsheba is in a position of tremendous power imbalance with possible very negative consequences for her. Definitely. In both cases, she is used, in the first by David and the second by Nathan, who was also excluded by Adoniah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think Nathan, we could read him as self-interested because he was also not invited, right? So they're having this feast, Adoniah is having this feast, and who are these people who've been excluded? It's like Solomon and Bathsheba and Natan and a few others that he's listed. And so there is, there's definitely some worry or anxiety around that. And what does that mean, right? What does it mean that Adoniah has excluded these people? Is Adoniah kind of aware that maybe Solomon is the rightful king, and so he's trying to kind of usurp and be sneaky about it? Or is he just not like Solomon, or both? Yeah. Other thoughts around this? I mean, it's nice here, at least we get to hear her voice. Like she says some words, we get to hear her talking to David. Whereas in the first one, I mean, I guess the first one she says, I am pregnant, but it's not a lot. that we get to hear. So we hear a little bit more here. Still not a ton. Yeah, I guess it's like, how much is she? Again, I think is the same in the first text, is like, how much of it is on her own? How much agency does she have? And is she here just going along with Nathan, and Nathan's like, okay, here's what you're going to do, and she just does it? Or is she, does she have a more active role? Is she like, okay, I want to do this, or like, I'm entering into this scheme, and not just being the object? Yeah, so some questions. So, okay, so quickly, I want to look at one more text, and this is a midrash that gives us another little hint about Bathsheba, or at least what the rabbis think about Bathsheba. And here, I think we even have her in like even more of an active role in a way. And so the background is that this midrash takes place after all of this, when Solomon is king. And even in the text, it talks about how Bathsheba would like sit to the right of King Solomon. She would be with King Solomon and like have a place next to his throne when he was judging his cases. So she has a certain position. And here we'll see her, I think, in the most active we will today, I think. So this is from Midrash Mishle, which is Midrash on Proverbs. And I'll read it quickly. Okay, getting close. So Rabbi Ishmael said, the same night that Solomon had completed the temple, he married the daughter of Pharaoh, right? So Solomon's the one he finally builds the temple. It's very, very elaborate. And so it's completed, and he marries the daughter of Pharaoh. And there was a great celebration in the temple. And the celebration of the daughter of Pharaoh rose above the celebration of the temple. So it's not great. As it is said, that it is always so that people flatter the king. In that moment, God thought of destroying the temple. As it says, the city has aroused my anger and my wrath from the day it was built until this day, so it must be removed from my sight. Right? So it's like this nice thing that King Solomon finally like built the temple, and then he's too busy kind of celebrating himself and his own marriage. And obviously God gets mad, as it makes sense. And Rabbi Levi said, according to the morning sacrifice that was coming close to regarding the morning sacrifice that was coming close to the 4th hour, what did the daughter of Pharaoh do? So, right, so this idea that there's the morning sacrifice, and this is actually transferred over to ideas around when we're supposed to say certain prayers, like what times we're supposed to say certain prayers before in the morning, like the Amidah. Anyway, so there's certain prayers that have to be offered before the 4th hour of the day. And so if it goes past the 4th hour, you can't really offer those sacrifices. So, okay, so we're getting close to this time when the sacrifices need to be offered because the temple's been built and ready to go. So what happens? So what's the daughter of Pharaoh do? She made a certain sheet and placed it above the bed and placed it on it stars and planets. And every time that Solomon would try to wake up, he would see these stars and planets and would return to sleep for another 4 hours. So here we have the daughter of Pharaoh is kind of tricking Solomon, trying to trick him to staying asleep. And so she's made it look like it's nighttime in his room, even though it's actually daytime. Rabbi Levi said, on that day, the morning sacrifice came close to being sacrificed in the 4th hour. And regarding that hour it was taught, there was a situation in which the morning tamid, that sacrifice, was sacrificed in the 4th hour. And the people of Israel were saddened, for it was the day of the inauguration of the temple, and they could not carry out the sacrifice because Solomon was asleep. And they were afraid of waking him because of fear of the kingship, right? So this whole story goes to say that like Solomon was too busy partying, he was asleep. Maybe his new wife kind of got involved to try and trick him to stay asleep. But whatever's happening, like King Solomon's asleep, he has the key with him, so they can't open the temple, and people are sad because they want to, start offering sacrifices in the temple. But they didn't want to wake him up because, again, he's the king, so scary. And then they went and told Bathsheba, his mother, and she went and woke him up and rebuked him, as it is written, rebuked that his mother rebuked him. So what are they going to do? They're like, we need to wake him up, but we can't wake him up. So who's going to wake him up? look at his mother. And so Bathsheba goes and wakes him up, and she scolds him and kind of, gives him a talking to, because he was asleep and he should have been on his game, and he was not doing the right thing. So I think here, right, Bathsheba, actually, we get her voice. I mean, it's imagined, it's in a midrash, so it's not in the original text, but we have her as someone who is righteous and who is helping her son stay righteous and like stay on that right path. So there we go. Any reactions to that one? It was like a little bit of a wild midrash, but it went a lot of ways. But I brought it in because I wanted to show you the end, which was about Bathsheba coming and scolding him. And yeah, so yeah, Eric says it was very nice that the midrash feels a need to give her more agency than the original text did. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel like I was actually surprised. I feel like there should be more midrash about her. But I didn't find as much as I thought I would. I feel like I really wanted to find some modern midrash on her, but maybe it needs to be written. I feel like she's I don't know. I feel like the story of David and Bathsheba gets like referenced a lot, but I think that there's a lot more to Bathsheba, and I want someone to like tease it out. She's just a interesting character here, and I mean, I feel like her whole arc is just, again, we could make another movie out of it. I mean, it's just so much going on, and like all this action, and we have the kings, and we have battle, and we have fighting for succession, and all of this right in the Tanakh. And I don't know. I often wonder if we read more of this type of stuff for the Haftorah, maybe it would be more interesting instead of just the prophecies of Isaiah and Ezekiel. And we get some of it, but we don't get as much. And this is just straight up stories that are also not the most flattering. But, yeah. And whenever have anything they'd like to add or takeaways, is are you familiar with Bathsheba? Did you notice anything new? Or old? Notice anything old?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Yeah, Eric said the stories was definitely not taught in grade school. Yeah, I and even the stories that were taught, I feel like from this book is like, right, like in Kings, we have King Solomon, of course, and I know I learned in grade school about Solomon and the baby, right, the baby that the two women wanted to cut in half, and then Solomon in his wisdom figures out who's the actual mom and all of that. And of course, in the original, if you read the original, it's like the two women were both prostitutes, and like there's kind of some like unseemly pieces of that. And yeah, it's an odd story too, but I guess that's for another time. Torah study is much more fun than just reading Torah. Thank you, Doreen. Yes, it's nice to kind of interact with it on a more on a different level, definitely. Yes. Cool. Well, thank you all for joining me for this little Torah Tuesday adventure. I know I really enjoyed getting to kind of look at some of these stories that I haven't looked at in a while, or haven't gotten to teach before. I think there's just so much wild stuff in the Tanakh, in our texts in general. And I mean, I imagine that sometimes it's not studied as much because I think it is so problematic that maybe for some people it's like easier to gloss over, but it's in there, and so might as well read it and think about kind of what lessons it can teach us and how it can reflect on our current realities, or how we hope maybe it doesn't reflect on our current realities. Cool. Well, thank you all, and I'll end a few minutes early so we have time for those of you who want to go over to Minyan, can head over to there. And I'm also teaching again. I know this is like a 2 for week, but I'm teaching on Thursday for the pre-high holiday session with Beth Tikva. So would love to see you there. I'll be doing stuff on Vidui, so it will be very different than today, but still something good to dive into as we're in the month of Elul, which, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. It's wild. So thank you all, and